Thanks. It's really exciting to be here. Certainly don't be impressed by the 5 degrees. My wife has the PhD in our family, and so she's more about quality and I'm more about quantity. So I understand this audience is much more about quality. If you haven't gotten a chance to try the Arctic apples, please do. I have an example of one of the apples here. I cut this yesterday, and so let it sit out. It's a little bit dry, but you can see that it still looks great, and you cut that off and it's still ready to eat. So I'm going to, let's see. And are we on? Now we're on. I like to walk and talk. So in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, and yet there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. And that's one of the challenges that we're all here to talk about today. But I also want to talk to you a little bit about how we talk about science. Because in many ways, it's less about can we innovate to feed the world in 2050, and it's more about will we be allowed to innovate, and will people allow us to do the things that the scientists are capable of doing. And so I want to talk about the psychology of food and the psychology of science. And some of the things that I want to get at today are sort of what business or sector are you guys in? And ask the question, well, who is your customer and why should they be buying your products? And they may seem like obvious questions, but when you start to look at how companies are marketing themselves, it's a little less obvious. And so the first question about what business are you in? And so there are 2 really great examples here today. And in some respects, when you look at this, that you could be a biotechnology company. On the other hand, the end result as a hamburger means that maybe you're a food company. And so if you look at Mosa Meat's website, they're really positioning themselves as a technology company and a technology platform. So even though they're talking about the food, they're really presenting themselves to the world. And that may be for different reasons. One, because they may see themselves as a platform company instead of a product company. But it could also be because they're marketing themselves to investors rather than consumers, recognizing that their products are down the road. So how do you see yourself? How does the world see you? And this can be contrasted with how Memphis Meats is presenting itself to the world, which is clearly as a food company. And I didn't really talk about it, but I'm from a company called Intrexon. How many of you in the room have heard of Intrexon? That's great. That is far more than most. It's unfortunate that the other 70% of you haven't. I'm head of communication, and so that's all my fault. So we do more than just the apple. We also do those genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Zika, the aqua bounty salmon, and we have 24 human therapeutics that nobody ever talks about, even though we're still trying to cure cancer. So there's a lot going on, and figuring out how to communicate who you are is really important. And one of the things that I want to talk about, though, is our brains. And it's important because our brains are lying to us every day, all the time. You cannot trust them. And so if you leave here today with knowing one thing, it's that do not trust your brain, even when it tells you that. So I'm going to give you some examples of how our brains are lying to us. So the first one is a visual illusion. And so when you look at this, you see the top and the bottom squares. And, when you look at it, I think most of it would say that the top square is dark and the bottom one is light. But if you pull out 2 circles, what you see is they're pretty much the same. And if we cover it, it's exactly the same color. Now, that's important because our brain is lying to us. What our brain is doing is it's trying to figure it out. And it says, well, that top square has direct light on it, and the bottom one is in indirect light. So it says, I'm going to make the top one darker and the bottom one lighter in order to address for shadowing. So our brain does that automatically. And it's important because no matter how much you know that the colors are the same, you can't see them as the same. So knowing and believing are not necessarily the same thing, or knowing and being able to see it. And that comes into how we talk about food as well. So I'm going to give you guys a math problem. Any third grader can get it right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. That's okay. The smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. This is called the bat and the ball problem. Now, a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer? I hear some 5 cents. I heard some 10 cents. All right, we're going to do the math. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. If the bat cost $1 more than the ball, and the ball cost 10 cents, well, that's $1.10 together. That's 120. That's not true. 5 cents plus $1.05. So we can all do the math. But many of us, even those who said 5 cents, may have thought 10 cents first. And that's what happens to us every day. We go through our day thinking we know the answer to questions that we are wrong about. And that's because we have a fast-thinking and a slow-thinking part of our brain. And that fast-thinking part of our brain is the one that tells us it's 10 cents. And that slow-thinking part is the one that does math. And it is lazy. And it will not do math unless it has to do math. And if it thinks it knows the answer, boom, it's gone. And so as people are introduced to your products and introduced to these sectors, they are making snap decisions that they are not going back and doing the math on. And that's important. So we need to reach them in a way that we get the right snap decision and talk to that fast-thinking part of our brain and give up on that lazy one. So that brings us to the topic of confirmation bias. And now a lot of you are really familiar with this idea that people seek out information that agrees with what they believe, and they avoid information that doesn't. But I'm not here to talk about what other people do. We know when other people are biased. What we don't know is when we're biased. So it's important for you to understand your biases, not other people's biases. So I'm going to give you an example of my own. So if I were to read in the newspaper today that organic agriculture was more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what would I do? I would ask, who wrote the research, who funded the research, and what were their methods? All perfectly reasonable things to do. Now, let's imagine that instead the article said that organic agriculture was no more nutritious than conventional agriculture. What would I do? I'd tweet it, right? It's consistent with what I believe. So when you disagree with something, you scratch the surface, you dig deeper, you try to find a problem. And you can always find a problem with any study. And so if we don't understand what we're doing, we can't understand what other people are doing, and we can't talk to them about it. And being able to talk is what's so important. So another example of a psychological principle is something called the availability heuristic. And it basically says, what things come to mind when I say something? So when I say the word natural, what things come to mind? Rainbows and unicorns and Ebola and Salmonella and Zika. They're all natural, right? So the point is that when we hear the word natural, we think happy thoughts. Now, we all know that all the bad things in the world are natural too, but that's just not what we think of. So if you have a choice between a natural product and an unnatural product, you can imagine which one people are going to gravitate to. So again, understanding this doesn't make them bad people because they like natural, and it doesn't make us good people because we, aren't convinced or tricked by the word natural. So understanding how other people do it, understanding how we're biased in exactly the same way as others is important. So now let's turn to the question of who is your customer. So my question is really for you guys. Is your customer vegan dude? Or in other words, are you trying to sell your product to people who believe what you believe? Or bacon gal? Are you trying to sell it to everybody in the world? And so thinking about who is my customer is important, because a lot of people will say it's bacon girl, and we heard a lot of that yesterday. There is apparently a love affair of bacon, and we all understand why. And so again, who is your customer? And I ask that question because now I want to give an example. And so this obviously comes from Perfect Day. And how do you communicate your brand and your product to the world? And so here they talk about sustainable, kind, and delicious. And so those are all wonderful things, and I know the people that work at the company, and they absolutely believe everything that they're saying. But what do those words mean to the world? Well, the word sustainable is about values. I share your value of sustainability. So that's what they're telling the world. Kind says, this is my ethical belief. And then delicious is about taste. We choose products based on taste and quality. We heard a lot about that this morning. So I'll return to the questions of the ethics here in a minute. Because the question of kindness goes to how some organizations talk about the issue of animal welfare and using animals. And we heard that yesterday, 60 billion animals consumed every year in order to feed 7 billion people. So that is trying to build on this idea of cognitive dissonance. In other words, how can you love one and eat the other? And it's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. And if you feel uncomfortable, then you have to choose. Which camp, which tribe do I belong to? So that's what this is forcing you down, as a decision as to which tribe you're in. So now the question is, does somebody have to share my ethical beliefs in order for them to consume my product? Now, from the conversations I've had over the last day and a half, I feel that by and large, people don't feel that they have to share their ethical beliefs in order to consume their product, that they would actually just like everybody to consume their product because the world would be a better place if they did. And it doesn't really matter if they do it just because it tastes great. That's okay. But how we market it matters. Because if you look at how people talk about clean meat or how they ask questions, you can see a lot about the values and the ethics that are behind it. So here you have a question that PETA asked, and I'm going to point to the part that says, this new meat will involve no cruelty and little environmental harm. We call that a loaded question. It could have as easily said, are you evil? If not, you will eat this product, right? Imagine 90% of the people said that they would eat the product and asked in this way. I mean, it's somewhat, it's something of a leading question, right? So the problem, though, is that, again, it raises ethics in the question itself, and so we really don't know what people think based on how this question is asked. But it also forces you to make an ethical decision when you're buying your food. You know, I don't necessarily know if I want to have to confront my ethical beliefs every time I take a bite. Same thing with clean food or clean meat. So I know that the sector or the industry has been thinking a lot about what to call their product. And there's a lot of comparisons that clean meat is a lot like clean energy. But I don't really think that's true. Because when I think of clean energy, I think of solar and wind. And when I think of dirty energy, I think of things like coal. But I don't really buy my energy because, you know, it's powered by coal or it's powered by solar. And if somebody said it was from coal, I'd be like, oh, really? I didn't know that. On the other hand, when I eat meat, it's because I like that product. And so that dirty meat is the meat I like, whereas that dirty energy is an energy I don't care about. And so, again, that dichotomy is forcing people to make a moral decision, an ethical decision, at the point of sell. And so, again, how we talk about this will matter. And it's important because when people are confronted with that question of cognitive dissonance, and they decide, I'm either with you or against you. Because what it does is it creates, resistance theory tells us, if you're confronted with somebody telling you what to do, and you choose not to do it, now you want to resist. So think about it, lab-grown meat, I don't like it. I just don't care about you. Clean meat, I am not an evil person, now I dislike you. So it forces people to make a decision, because if I don't like it, then I must dislike you because you just said that I'm eating unethical products. You've already made a value decision about me. And so you're forcing people to be against you. And so every person who doesn't buy your product then is your enemy. And over the last day and a half, we've seen a lot of that on social media. That there has been this conversation that people feel under attack themselves, and then they're responding in how they communicate about this. So they're important questions, and the question is, do we have to engage in these conversations? So that's the question, is when you're doing marketing, I think the first rule is do no harm. Try not to offend your customers. Things that turn people off, cruelty-free, mass-produced, feeding the world, all of those things are things that generally turn off audiences because that's not why they're buying their food. And something that I learned before I joined this company, I spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of State doing global food policy. And I learned that if you lead with science, you will lose with science. Science at the beginning of a conversation just polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree more. And so you really can't start with science for any conversation. And so the reality is that most people that buy your product will not do it because of the ethical reasons that you have. They'll do it in spite of the ethics. And so we need to recognize why people will buy the products. And I forgot to put that slide in there, which it would go. So we need really cruelty-free marketing, not cruelty-free meats. So there are different ways of talking about food. Now, this is not my daughter, but it could be because she is not the most adventurous eater in the world. And I was giving this talk in Milan a couple years ago, and I put this up, and she was in the audience, and she's like, "You don't use that slide when I'm not there, do you?" And I said, "No, of course not." At least not when it's being live streamed. And so the question is, how do we talk about food in a way that doesn't turn people off and excites them? So I'm going to give some examples. First, I'm going to ask you a question. How many people in the room have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? Please raise your hand. I know there are a lot because there are a lot of Kiwis in the room. And so I am disappointed, though, that this audience, which seems pretty diverse and forward-thinking, has not tried Kiwis, but I highly recommend them. It's really great. And, of course, back in 1910, some intrepid Kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, came back, created a new variety, and, most importantly, rebranded it. The rest is history. Because when it's a Chinese gooseberry, it is a hairy fruit. And when it is a kiwi, it is cute and fuzzy. How we talk about things matters. So I'm going to give you guys another example. Some of you may have heard of the idea that if a third grader can't pronounce it, you shouldn't put it in your mouth. And I know a lot of scientists, when they hear that, they start trying to beat up with people with science to explain why that's crazy. I just put the slide up and show them that pretty much everything we eat is filled with chemicals. Do not tell anybody else. They're totally unaware of this. And so you can show them this image, people laugh, and they get it. So I found that it's much easier to lead people to knowledge than to beat them up with science. And so, again, how we talk about things is as important, if not more important, than what we're doing. So sometimes people will ask me, what's the scariest food you know? And I always say, the seedless watermelon. Because where do they come from? They have no seeds. Unless I'm talking to the seedless watermelon people, then I use a different example. So I was wondering, where do you get seedless watermelon? So I did a little research on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's true. You start with a watermelon with 2 sets of chromosomes. You're like, oh my God, it's got chromosomes. No, you guys know that. And then you expose it to a natural plant extract called colchicine, which is also highly toxic and mutagenic. I added the skull and crossbones, so you'll be more worried. But that's okay. It now produces a watermelon with 4 sets of chromosomes. Well, still produces seeds, so what do? You cross it back with the original watermelon. You end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up it will not produce seeds. And that's the one you eat. No nutritional analysis, no food safety evaluation. This is conventional breeding, folks. Now, if somebody were telling us that it's produced with mutagens, it's got chromosomes, people would be like, oh my God, I'm definitely not going to do that again. But nobody is. So we worry about the things people tell us to worry about. How could it be any different? We don't worry about things we don't know about. How could it be any different? So I am not trying to convince you to stop eating the seedless watermelons. I do not need any more hate mail from the seedless watermelon lobby. They are vicious. So the point is that we worry about things that people tell us to worry about. And how can we talk about it in a way that doesn't get people worried? And so part of it is we need to figure out trust. And trust is really important. So some of the elements of trust are the shared values we have, demonstrating competence, and also transparency. And these things together lead to trust. These are the foundations of trust. And so trust, of course, is what gives us the social license in order to bring products to market. And so trust is going to be critically important for your sector because people don't know about it. And so now the question is, how do you build trust? So one way that people are doing it is they're trying to demonstrate shared values. And so I've looked at a lot of the websites, and I see things about gluten-free or antibiotic-free or hormone-free. And so on one hand, they might say, well, this is about transparency. We are trying to be transparent that we don't have these things. I think it's a little bit more about trying to be part of their tribe. That you know that some people are worried about these things and you want them to be part of your tribe, and so you're telling them what you don't have. But one of the things and this is how other companies end up with things like gluten-free, GMO-free water. Now, it's easier when the consumers have a false belief to cater to the belief than to try to eradicate it. This is what happens when marketing people get to lead product development instead of the scientists. But for me, this also ultimately undermines confidence in you as an organization when you bring these products to market, because if you don't believe that your product is better because of that negative labeling, then you're really misleading the consumer, because you're trying to associate yourself with a value that they have that you don't actually share. So understanding what tribe you're in, understanding how to communicate science is just really important. And so the question that you also don't see on a lot of these websites is, GMO-free. And that's important because the people that care about gluten-free and hormone-free probably also care about GMO-free. And so when you don't talk about something people expect, and then they later find out that it's something that you have, and they've assumed that you were non-GMO, then you can get that resistance, that people not just not wanting your product, but actively working to fight you. And there's some real questions as to how we understand this. And so how one company has described it is they try to associate what they're doing with how we produce chymosin and other things in our products, and then suggesting that their product is non-GMO. Now, a good example is in Europe. And in Europe, how their GMO labeling works is that if you're made from a GMO, like corn and soy, you must be labeled. If you're made with a GMO, like beer, wine, and cheese, you're not labeled. Well, I'm not sure most consumers understand the distinction between made from and made with, but the distinction is if you're made with a GMO, you have no labeling in Europe. And so understanding that, but most of the products we're talking about today, the GMO is the final product. It's not even an ingredient, it is the product. And so it really would be labeled. So again, understanding how to talk about these things is going to be important. Now, people, when it comes to organic foods, you want your organic food to come from a local farm, but you don't necessarily want your lab-grown meat to come from the local lab. And so, again, understanding who our partners are, what are the parallels to us on the journey that we're going through is important. And there are these competing worldviews. On one hand, we have this slow food movement that says we should produce food the way we have 100 years ago, and then we have this high-tech version, which is that we should produce food better, faster, smarter. Guess which of these groups you guys are in? And yet the tribe that you perhaps most closely associate with is the other one, because you may feel very close to the people that are working on slow food and other things. So again, understanding the tribe that we're in, understanding that tribes that are our allies is going to be important for the relationships we build. One thing I like to say is people love innovation almost as much as they despise change, and there's nowhere they despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together as friends, as family. It makes us feel close. And if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family. So it's not surprising that these things evoke very strong emotions. So we all need to become better storytellers. We need to find ways of personalizing our stories, acknowledging the concerns that people have because they're truly and deeply felt. In 13 years at the State Department, I never once met a person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government and didn't trust big business, but they all love science. Calling somebody anti-science is like saying, you're an idiot, but let's talk. Found it doesn't work that well. And then we need to find ways of connecting with people because we do all want to feed the world in 2050 in a sustainable way. So that truly is an opportunity, and that helps us to build trust. And it's only when we have trust that we can talk about science. I know I'm running out of time here. There are ways of framing the conversation around food waste. When it was framed when the restaurant in New York called Wasted served food waste to people at $100 a plate, it was framed around sustainability, and people loved it. When pink slime came to market, it was framed around health and safety, even though the pink slime avoided 700 million pounds of food waste, twice the food waste of Belgium in a given year, and this avoided maybe a couple thousand pounds of food waste. How we talk about things matters. And so going back to Perfect Day and how they're talking about how they're just making the system better, I think is a good example of how to communicate the values that you have in a way that shows that you're part of the solution and you want to work with other people as opposed to offending your audience and your potential partners. So last point, why all of this matters. Now, many of you are aware of the fact that we're going from 7 to 9 billion people, and we're adding 1 billion people every 12 or 13 years. Now, back in 1969, the population bomb came out, and it basically said that in the next 10 or 15 years, 1 billion people are going to die, and we should let them. Because it's actually a problem sending them food aid, we're just extending the misery. Now, of course, those billion people didn't die, and that's because the Green Revolution was already well underway, and by 1970, Norman Borlaug had already won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, there were obviously environmental concerns raised with the Green Revolution, but I think saving a billion lives goes in the plus ledger. So it's an important issue, but people are still worried about that population growth. But in 1950, the average woman had 5 or 6 kids. In the developing world, it was 7 or 8 children. And today, though, it's about a little over 2.5. According to the Swedish statistician Hans Rosling, the year 2014 was the year of peak child. The number of children born that year was the most that will ever be born in a given year throughout human history. It's all downhill after this. So you may be wondering, how can we go from 7 to 9 billion people if we're not having more kids? Well, it's because people are living longer. And that's a good news story, and it's because of better health and nutrition. And that's important. But the question is, how do we get to 2050 without screwing up our planet? Because that's when population growth really slows down. And so if we are able to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest and draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers, in many ways, we'll be good forever. So there's an opportunity. But the challenge is, how do we get there? So the thought that I want to leave you with is that the next 35 years are not just the most important 35 years in the history of agriculture and food, and they are. They're the most important 35 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture, and that's why we need to get it right, and that's why we need the technologies that are here today. We don't need them tomorrow. We don't need them in 20 years. We need them now. And so please work with me to help build trust in your industry so that you can bring your innovations to market. Thank you.
We have a ton of questions, so we're going to take a little extra time because everybody has a lot that they want to know about this. What I want to lead with is whether there are any context, as in, for example, public policy, in which we should offer ethical reasons for eating, quote, clean meat, or will it always backfire when we use that kind of language?
So it can be relevant to working with policymakers and regulators and others that do care about these issues. Animal welfare issues do matter to the Department of Agriculture, and many members of Congress do care about these ethical concerns. So there is a time and a place for it. Absolutely.
Did Monsanto go wrong in their communication regarding GMOs or in their green imperialism by and through GMOs?
So I think that the problem that Monsanto had is nobody cared about agriculture before GMOs arrived. And so they didn't even know that a conversation was important. The scientists that were working on it thought, these are greener technologies, so of course they're going to be better, and of course they're going to be accepted. But that coincided with an explosion in interest in food. So the 1980s were the time when we started going from, 2 types of tomato sauce to 100 types of tomato sauce, and all of these different types of salad dressing and Grey Poupon and aspirations. And so there was this real focus on food in a way that there hadn't been in the decade before. So it was really a confluence of questions and things that happened. And then they were incredibly slow to recognize that the world had changed. And that's the challenge that you guys face, is that, very possible the next Monsanto is in this room if you don't get it right, and if you offend all of the customers for everybody else. So that's the real challenge. I don't care what Monsanto did. I care what you guys do.
Right. I've heard that before, that it doesn't necessarily matter who did the wrong thing. It's who's going to save us in the future, who's going to do it right moving forward.
Right.
And we have that opportunity. So how can we lay that groundwork? How can we lay the groundwork for that communication strategy? What can we do to avoid becoming Monsanto?
So I think the important thing is that, one, you're talking to each other through organizations like New Harvest and the Good Food Institute. That's really important. And coming up with strategies as an industry to move forward are really important. And learning lessons from each other in real time is very important. And so, if you look at how many of the companies in this room have transitioned from their communication 2 years ago to today, it's changed really fast. And so certainly nothing is lost because the products are still, a few years away. So the public is only generally aware of it. So there's plenty of time to get it right. So, I would just say, work more closely through the organizations that exist.
Excellent. So This next question, I think, is what strategies can we employ to make people feel good about cellular agriculture products without making them feel bad about themselves or traditional modes of consumption?
Right. Well, for me, cellular meat is meat, and I don't think they need to feel good about eating it. They just need to eat it. And if it's a great product and people like it and it's cool, then you're going to be fine. And so I think a lot of the marketing of companies like Impossible Foods and Memphis Meats and others is trying to position this as an exciting opportunity. So you guys should love your science. You should not be afraid of your science. You should be able to talk about your science. And I think it's an opportunity, not baggage that has to be hidden.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Should cellular agriculture businesses partner with third-party validators or become public benefit corporations to reinforce their commitments to doing things better, I guess?
I don't think anybody cares. If you've got a quality meat product and people want it, they really don't care if you're partnering with a social benefit organization. One of the advantages of this sector versus organic is with organic, small is beautiful. And people actually aren't happy when organic companies get really big because then they just become big food. On the other hand, people want their biotech companies to be big because that demonstrates competence. So the opportunity to partner with larger organizations is not going to be seen as selling out to the average person. And so, I mean, it's actually an opportunity that this sector has that they can partner early without sort of the concerns that the small organic companies had.
Excellent. And I think one more. So is CRISPR making the public feel more positively about, where did it go? Oh, making the public feel more positively about science and science combined with food by displacing people's aversion towards science that is, we've sort of seen a surge of because of GMOs.
Yeah, so I don't think that we've seen actually a lot of anti-science. I mean, the opposition to biotechnology has to do with the values that underlie it, not with science itself. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think most people know anything about CRISPR. I don't think most people know how to pronounce it. So I think a very small group of people are aware of it and that's going to drive this policy. So understanding the scientists, and then you have the philosophers who communicate science to the rest of the 90% of the public. And so we really need to reach those voices that are the communicators of science to the world. And those are the people we need to reach. We don't necessarily have to reach everybody. Mm-hmm. And so widening the range of people we talk to. And the scientists, that's why you guys need to become better communicators, because then you can speak for yourselves and you have to let somebody else speak for you. But always start with your story. Why are you doing what you do? Personalize it, and then talk about the science. Thanks.
I love that idea of humanizing the technology. That's really powerful. Everybody, I'd like to thank Jack. Give him a round of applause. This was an excellent conversation. Thank you.